The kitchen smelled faintly of espresso and something expensive, like polished stone and distant rain. James Crawford stood at the marble counter, staring at the slim white stick lying there as if it were something radioactive. 2 pink lines. Positive. He loosened his tie, his fingers suddenly clumsy, and tried to speak. The words felt heavy, alien. Across from him, Emma Thompson stood still in her scrubs, her dark hair pulled back in a practical knot, her face flushed with the kind of hope that only comes after years of waiting for good news. And this should have been good news. "We'll move together," she said quietly, as if stating a fact no one could argue. "James, this is our baby." But James didn't look at her. His jaw tightened. His hand smoothed the front of his suit jacket in a gesture that told her everything she needed to know. "There is no we in this decision," he said. His voice was flat, cold, like he was reading a line from some tired script. "The board has already approved the merger. I'm marrying Helen Chen next month." Her breath left her in a slow, stunned exhale. For a moment there was only silence. Emma's hands curled tightly around the edge of the counter, steadying herself against the blow. "Helen Chen," she repeated, tasting the name like acid. "Your investor's daughter. How long has this been going on?" James still wouldn't meet her eyes. "It's not what you think," he said too smoothly. "It's business." She almost laughed. Almost. But it caught in her throat, tight and bitter. "I'm carrying your child," Emma said. "And you're standing there telling me about business." He picked up his briefcase as if they were in a conference room, ending a meeting. "You'll be taken care of," he said. "The penthouse is yours. The accounts will be transferred by morning." "You mean your lawyers will handle it?" she said, her voice cracking. He turned to leave. His hand paused on the doorknob, but he didn't look back. "Don't try to contact me." And then he was gone. Just like that. Emma stood in the echoing silence of the apartment, the soft digital beep of the pregnancy test punctuating the stillness. Positive. She hadn't imagined it. Her hand rested instinctively on her stomach, as if she could shield the life growing inside her from the wreckage. Her phone buzzed, the screen lighting up with a message from Sarah. How did he take the news? Another buzz. A news alert. Cord Technologies announces merger with Chen Global. CEO James Crawford to wed Helen Chen in private Singapore ceremony. The room tilted. Emma stumbled toward the bathroom, barely making it before she was sick. She stayed there for a long time, kneeling on the cold tile, her hands braced against the porcelain. Her pager shrieked, "Trauma call. Emergency surgery." No time for breakdowns. She splashed cold water on her face and stared at the reflection glaring back at her from the mirror. She was Dr. Emma Thompson, a surgeon, a professional, a woman who had worked too hard to lose everything now. She grabbed her keys on her way out, slipping the pregnancy test into her pocket. It wasn't sentimentality. It was evidence. Proof that her life had changed. Twice. By the time she reached her car, her phone was buzzing again. Another system notification. Your access to the following accounts has been terminated. She swiped it away without reading. There were lives to save. Hers could wait. The morning after her shift, Emma stood at an ATM. The screen flashed the same message over and over. Account access denied. She pressed her forehead against the cool metal of the machine, exhaustion and panic blending into something sharp in her chest. Dark. Thompson. Sarah's voice cut through the fog. She appeared with 2 coffee cups, her scrubs pristine. "You look like hell." Emma took the cup without thinking. "He cleaned out everything," she said. "Even my personal account." "That's illegal," Sarah snapped. "He can't." "He did." Emma scrolled through her notifications showing Sarah the evidence. The penthouse locks had already been changed. "I tried going home after my shift." Sarah stared at her. "You slept in the on-call room. It's fine." Emma took a sip of coffee and grimaced. "Morning sickness makes this taste like battery acid." "You're moving in with me." Sarah's tone brooked no argument. "I've already got the spare room ready." Sarah. "I've mapped out 3 banks within walking distance of the hospital." Sarah continued. "We'll open a new account at lunch. My cousin's a lawyer. He's already drawing up paperwork." Emma's throat tightened, the tears coming fast and hot. Don't thank me," Sarah warned, pulling her into a quick, fierce hug. "Just promise me one thing." "Anything," Emma whispered. "When you're back on your feet." and you will be. We make him regret ever hearing the name Emma Thompson." Emma's pager beeped again. Another emergency. She wiped her face, straightened her coat, and managed a weak smile. Deal. 3 months later, Emma sat in Sarah's living room. The glossy cover of a business magazine stared back at her. James and Helen, the picture perfect couple. Singapore glittered in the background of their wedding photos. "Stop torturing yourself," Sarah muttered, taking the magazine away. "Look at this instead. A hospital letter." Emma read the words twice. They approved it. "Full funding," Sarah confirmed. "You're leading your own research team." While James had been marrying for mergers, Emma had been revolutionizing pediatric surgery. Her hand settled on her belly as the baby kicked. Not long now. Her phone buzzed. Another missed call from Margaret Crawford. She blocked the number. "She keeps calling the hospital." "She's your baby's grandmother," Sarah said carefully. "She's his grandmother," Emma corrected. "I'm not going back to Boston." "You're building something here," Sarah said. "And you're not alone." Emma reached for her laptop, opening the investment tracker Michael had set up. Small, cautious steps. Buying stock. Gaining leverage. 3 years from now, she'd be ready. She'd never see it coming. As she headed out for another emergency consult, Emma smiled quietly to herself. Let James build his empire in Singapore. She was building something stronger. A legacy. And this time, no one would take it away. Emma's hands were steady, despite the pain lancing through her back. The pressure was sharp, insistent, but she ignored it. She'd gotten used to ignoring pain. On the surgical table, a tiny heart stilled under the glare of cold operating lights. Her focus was absolute. BP's Clemming. Dura. Martinez warned from across the table. "I'm aware," Emma said, her voice crisp. She adjusted her grip on the surgical tools, barely feeling the contraction that seized her. "We're not closing until this heart beats on its own." Sarah stood nearby, watching her closely, concern dark in her eyes. "Emma," she said quietly, "let me finish." "Almost done," Emma said, already closing the final suture. And then, there it was, the beep of a steady rhythm. The child's heart found its pace. "Dear, close for me," Emma murmured, stepping back. And then her knees buckled. Strong hands caught her before she hit the floor. "She's in labor," Sarah barked, snapping orders. Someone was shoving an IV into her arm. Emma winced but didn't fight it. She was too busy counting heartbeats in her head. Hers the baby's. The child she'd just saved. They wheeled her through the corridors she knew better than her own home, her surgical gown swapped for a hospital one. It was surreal, lying in a bed when for years she'd been the one giving orders. "Not this time. 14 hours. Sarah muttered, wiping sweat from Emma's brow hours later. "You really know how to make an entrance." And then Lucas arrived, his lungs full of fight and fury, his cry echoing off the sterile white walls. Emma stared at him, stunned by how small and perfect he was. Black hair, dark eyes that squinted open just long enough to look directly at her. He had James's chin, her eyes. "He looks like him," Emma whispered. Sarah leaned close, her voice firm. "No, he looks like you strong. Stubborn. A miracle." A nurse entered carrying a massive bouquet of flowers. "From Margaret Crawford," she explained, placing them by the window. The card was simple. "Congratulations." Emma didn't ask how she knew. It was Margaret. She always knew. Later, after the stitches and the paperwork and the constant parade of well-meaning nurses, Emma sat alone with Lucas. He was swaddled tight, his tiny fist gripping her finger as if he'd never let go. "We're going to be okay," she promised him softly. "You and me." Her phone buzzed on the bedside table. Breaking news. Crawford Technologies opened its Singapore headquarters. James smiling for the cameras, hand in hand with Helen Chen. "Building the future," the caption read. Emma smiled faintly and glanced at Lucas. "Let him build whatever he wants," she whispered. "We're building something better." 3 years passed like a storm. Quiet at times, violent at others. Emma's life was a carefully balanced act of surgery schedules and single motherhood. Lucas was precocious from the start, walking early, talking in full sentences by 18 months. By 2, he was assembling puzzles designed for children twice his age. Sarah watched him with equal parts pride and exasperation. "He's a genius," she said one afternoon, watching Lucas demolish a 100-piece dinosaur puzzle in 10 minutes flat. "You realize that, right?" Emma smiled without looking up from her research notes. Most kids are special, Sarah snorted. Yours is terrifying. On the muted television, a headline scrolled across the bottom of the screen. Crawford Technologies stock plummets amid divorce rumors. CEO James Crawford and Helen Chen expected to separate. Sarah muted it before Emma could glance up. It's not worth your time. I'm not worried about James, Emma said, though she had seen the news weeks ago. Margaret had called her from Boston, still trying to reach out, still trying to mend something Emma wasn't sure could ever be whole. Lucas appeared in the doorway, holding up a piece of his puzzle. Mommy, can you help? Emma stood, stretching tired muscles, always. As they worked together on the puzzle, her phone buzzed again. Johns Hopkins. An invitation to present her latest pediatric heart procedure at the international conference. She smiled. Baltimore next month. Convenient timing. That was when James was set to receive his innovation award. He's not your problem anymore, Sarah said quietly later that night, watching Emma pack for the trip. No, Emma agreed. But his company is. The hospital gala was dazzling. Emma walked the red carpet in emerald silk, Lucas holding her hand. At 3, he looked heartbreakingly handsome in his little tuxedo. Cameras flashed, reporters whispered. Sarah appeared at her side, her voice low. He's here. Emma didn't flinch. Of course James was there. Crawford Technologies had donated a wing to the hospital. She spotted him across the room. He hadn't changed much. Older. Tired around the eyes, but still polished. He stared at them, Emma, Lucas, Sarah, as if he were looking at strangers. Emma held her head high and moved toward the stage. She spoke of tiny hearts, the ones she'd fixed and the ones still waiting, of resilience and hope. Lucas stood proudly beside her as she accepted the award, placing it in her hands as he said clearly into the microphone, "Congratulations, Dr. Mommy." Applause thundered. James was still watching from the bar. He didn't move. He didn't speak later. As Lucas charmed the hospital board, Sarah nudged Emma. He left. Emma nodded. Good. The next morning brought chaos. Margaret's health was failing, the cancer stealing what strength she had left. Emma rushed to her side, Lucas in tow. Singapore. Margaret whispered, Helen wants you there. You should go. Emma stayed silent. The offer was dangerous. Helen was offering leverage. An alliance. Margaret squeezed her hand. Lucas will want to see me while he can. Emma nodded. I'll bring him after surgery. She flew to Singapore 2 days later. The boardroom was sterile and cold. James's face was white when she walked in. Helen's smile was tight and sharp. Emma connected her laptop to the screen. Footage of Lucas solving complex problems played for the entire board. This is Lucas Thompson, she said. My son. And James, Chaos erupted. I'm voting my shares and my son's shares in favor of Helen Chen, Emma said. James Crawford is hereby removed as CEO. Her phone buzzed as she left. Margaret was crashing. Emma ran for the airport. Margaret passed before she landed. At the hospital, Lucas held his grandmother's hand. Emma joined them, tears blurring her vision. She left something for you, Sarah said, handing Emma an envelope and a USB drive. Inside was everything. The merger papers, backdated stock transfers, evidence of fraud. James had orchestrated everything before he knew about the baby. Emma, read the letter last. Use this wisely. Not for revenge. For losing, she would. Margaret had trusted her with the future. Her phone buzzed again. She answered. You won, he said quietly. No, Emma said. I just stopped losing. She hung up. At home, Lucas slept peacefully. She sealed Margaret's and James's letters in an envelope for him to read when he was 18. And then she wrote her own. You were always my choice. She closed it and tucked it away. Her pager buzzed. Emergency surgery. She slipped on her coat. Some choices echo forever, but sometimes they become something else entirely. The conference hall was quiet, the lights dimmed, except for the stage where Emma stood behind the podium. Her hand rested lightly on the glass award she had just received, but her gaze was fixed on the front row. Lucas, now 6, sat straight back between Sarah and one of his favorite nurses, his tiny hands folded neatly on his lap. He gave her a thumbs up, grinning wide enough to make his dimples appear. The same dimples his father had, but deeper somehow, more sure of themselves. This work began. Emma started, her voice steady but warm, with a question. How can we make tiny hearts stronger, safer, and give children the futures they deserve? She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the crowd. Some were peers, some competitors, and many had dismissed her early work as impossible. They were listening now. What I've found over these years is that innovation doesn't come from certainty. It comes from necessity. And no one teaches you about necessity more than a child who needs a chance to live. She caught sight of movement near the back of the auditorium. A figure, lingering just beyond the glow of the lights. James. He stood quietly, not drawing attention, not stepping closer. But he was there, watching. Emma turned back to the microphone, ignoring the way her pulse jumped. And no one teaches you about hope more than a child who refuses to give up. She smiled toward Lucas. Or a child who believes he can help fix the world. The crowd erupted into applause. Lucas clapped too, though his attention was already shifting to the small model heart on the table nearby. Emma stepped down from the stage and let the organizer hand her a second certificate. Another recognition. Another reminder that all her late nights and early mornings mattered. Sarah met her at the bottom of the stairs. He left, she said quietly, without looking at Emma. Emma nodded. Good. Later, as they walked back to their hotel suite, Lucas skipping ahead between them, Sarah broke the silence again. You know, you're going to have to talk to him sometime. Emma shook her head. No, I don't. He's his father. No, Emma corrected. James was a decision. Lucas is the consequence, and I don't owe James anything. Sarah sighed but didn't argue. At breakfast the next morning, Lucas studied the menu with all the seriousness of a surgeon planning an operation. Mommy, can I have pancakes shaped like hearts? Emma smiled as she flagged down the server. We can do that. They were halfway through their meal when Lucas spoke again, his voice quiet. Grandma Margaret would have liked these. Emma's chest tightened. She would have loved them, she agreed. Do you think Daddy liked pancakes when he was a little boy? Lucas asked without looking up. Sarah nearly choked on her coffee. Emma took a breath. Maybe, she said carefully. But I don't know. Lucas nodded, as if filing the information away for later. He was like that. Always listening, always watching. James's mind, Margaret had said once. Emma believed it. But Lucas's heart, well, that was all his own. 2 months later, Emma stood in the Margaret Crawford pediatric wing, watching Lucas read aloud to a group of younger patients. He read with exaggerated voices, pausing to explain words they didn't understand. He was patient, kind, and when he finished, he let them pass his tablet around so they could see the virtual heart models he'd designed. Sarah appeared at her side. We have a problem. Emma tore her gaze from Lucas reluctantly. What now? James, Sarah said quietly. He's here. Emma's stomach tightened. Here, in the lobby. Emma exhaled slowly. Does Lucas know? Sarah shook her head. He's busy being amazing. Emma squared her shoulders and walked down to the lobby. James was standing near the reception desk, holding a thick file. He looked tired, thinner, but his eyes were still sharp. I'm not here to make trouble, he said before she could speak. I wanted to give you this. He held out the folder. What is it? Emma asked without reaching for it. Proof, James said quietly. Proof that I'm trying to do something right. She stared at him for a long moment before taking it. Inside were documents, plans for a charity, funding for pediatric cardiac research, donations to children's hospitals, including hers. Why? Emma asked, flipping through the pages. Because Lucas deserves better, James said. And I can't undo what I did. But I can do this. Emma nodded slowly. You're not meeting him. James's jaw tightened. Wasn't going to ask. But they both knew he was lying. Emma closed the folder and tucked it under her arm. This doesn't change anything. I know. As she turned to walk away, he said softly, He's brilliant, isn't he? Emma stopped but didn't turn around. He's mine. Lucas came home that night with a new drawing for his wall. It was a heart. Not the cartoon kind with scalloped edges, but a perfect anatomical model in red and blue, arteries, veins, valves. And inside it, he had written, Mommy Lucas Pastrong. Emma hung it above his bed after he fell asleep. By the time Lucas was 7, his name was known in pediatric research circles. He'd co-authored a paper with Emma. Well, he dictated it while she typed, and was already designing models for surgical tools. Margaret had left him a legacy. Emma had given him a future, and he was building both, piece by careful piece. One evening, after a long day in surgery, Emma came home to find Lucas sitting at the kitchen table, his brows furrowing it. She said simply. He nodded, not needing more. But when she leaned in just a little closer, resting her shoulder lightly against his, it said everything she wasn't ready to put into words yet. Lily's shrieks of laughter brought their attention back to the playground. She had made a new friend, a little boy about her age. The two of them ran in circles, pretending to be superheroes. Edward smiled. There was something deeply grounding about watching her play, about seeing her happy without needing him to perform or impress. Later, they sat at a small cafe across from the park, Lily munching happily on a grilled cheese sandwich. Edward caught Clara studying him more than once. Each time, she didn't look away when he met her eyes. "You ever think it'd be like this?" she asked after a while. He took a moment. "No," he admitted. "I didn't think I could have something this simple." "It's not simple," Clara said. "But it's good." He nodded, accepting that. And it was good. It was messy and complicated and full of moments he hadn't planned for. But it was real. One evening, Clara called him. It wasn't about Lily. It was about her. She sounded tired, overwhelmed. The way she used to when they were married, back when they didn't know how to reach each other. He showed up at her door 10 minutes later. "Edward," she started, surprised to see him standing there with takeout in his hands. "I didn't." "You didn't have to," he said. "Let me in." She stepped aside and they sat on the couch, eating in silence at first. Then she started to talk. About work, about life, about being a mother and trying to remember who she was outside of that. He listened, really listened. Not because he was planning his next move, but because he wanted to understand. By the time Lily woke from her nap and wandered sleepily into the living room, they were both laughing quietly over something small and ridiculous. Lily climbed onto Edward's lap without hesitation, curling against him. It was the first time Clara didn't tense when she saw it. "I think," Clara said slowly, "we're doing okay." Edward glanced down at Lily, who had already fallen back to sleep in his arms. "Yeah," he said. "I think we are." When Lily's preschool held its annual father-daughter dance, Clara brought home the flyer and placed it in front of Edward. "You don't have to," she said, but her voice was careful. He picked up the paper, reading the details as if it were another contract. "I want to." Clara gave him a long look. Then she nodded. "She'll be thrilled." The night of the dance, he arrived with a corsage, tiny purple flowers that made Lily giggle when he clipped them to her wrist. Clara watched from the doorway as he knelt to straighten Lily's shoes and fix the bow in her hair. At the community center, he found himself surrounded by other fathers, some who looked just as nervous as he felt, some who were clearly seasoned pros at this kind of thing. He followed Lily's lead. When she wanted to dance, he danced. When she wanted to sit and eat cupcakes, he ate cupcakes. At one point, the DJ played a slow song. Lily tugged on his hand, pulling him toward the center of the room. He hesitated. This wasn't his world, but she didn't let go. He held her carefully, swaying awkwardly at first, then not so awkwardly. She rested her cheek against his chest, humming softly. Clara took a picture from the side of the room. Edward saw her, saw the tears she tried to blink away, and smiled. Afterward, Lily fell asleep in the back seat of the car. Edward carried her up the stairs to Clara's apartment, laying her gently in bed. Clara stood beside him silent for a moment. "She loves you," she whispered. Edward kissed Lily's forehead, then turned to Clara. "I love her." "I know," she said. He stood there for a long time, unsure of what came next. Then Clara stepped closer, resting her hand on his chest. It wasn't a kiss. It wasn't a promise. But it was something, and it was enough for now. Weeks passed, and Edward found himself falling into a life he hadn't known he could have. The boardrooms were still there. The contract still needed signing, but they no longer held the same weight. His phone buzzed less, or maybe he just answered it less. He spent his mornings making pancakes for Lily, even though his first attempts were embarrassingly bad. She'd laughed the first time he flipped one onto the floor, and he'd laughed with her, the sound strange in his own ears, but real. Clara let him in more as time passed. She wasn't handing over trust like a gift wrapped in ribbon, but piece by piece he earned it. The nights they sat at the park bench, watching Lily chase fireflies, became their rhythm. He would steal glances at her when she wasn't looking, and sometimes she'd catch him. They'd hold the look for a beat too long, and then Lily's giggle would break the silence. And they'd both smile like it hadn't just happened. One Saturday, Clara called him unexpectedly. He was at his office, finishing up paperwork he now realized he'd been dragging out on purpose. "Lily's sick," she said quietly. "She's asking for you." Edward was already grabbing his coat. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. He broke every speed limit to get there in half the time. When Clara opened the door, she looked tired. She stepped back without a word, and he moved past her straight to Lily's room. His daughter was curled up in bed, flushed, hair damp against her forehead. She blinked up at him with glassy eyes. "You came," she whispered. "Of course I did," he said, sitting beside her. He smoothed her hair back, his hand lingering a second longer than it should have, because he needed to feel that she was real and warm and here. He read her stories until she drifted off. Then he stayed there, not moving, not daring to leave her side. Clara stood in the doorway watching, her arms crossed, but not in anger. She watched him like she was seeing something she didn't quite believe yet. Later, they sat on the couch, both quiet. Edward hadn't planned to stay, but he didn't want to leave. Clara said finally. "For what?" "For coming. I'd always come," he said. "I didn't know that before." She nodded. "I do." Edward left long after midnight, but not before kissing Lily's forehead again and promising he'd be back in the morning. And he was. Their lives became intertwined in ways none of them expected. Clara started inviting him to dinner more often. Sometimes they sat together on the balcony after Lily had gone to sleep, wine glasses in hand, talking like they used to, back when things were new and uncomplicated. He told her about his childhood for the first time, about the father who was more ghost than man, and the mother who did her best but wasn't enough. Clara listened quietly, her fingers tracing the rim of her glass. "You don't have to be him," she said. "I know," he replied. But hearing her say it mattered. They didn't talk about what was happening between them. They didn't need to. It was there in every quiet glance, in every brush of fingers when they reached for the same plate, in the way Lily smiled wider when they were both there. Then came the day Edward dreaded. "I want to tell her," he said one evening. Clara looked up from her book. "Tell her what?" "That I'm her father." Clara exhaled slowly, closing the book. "She already knows?" He frowned. "We've never said." "She knows," Clara repeated. "She's waiting for you to tell her." Edward stared at her, feeling something tighten in his chest. "How do I even start?" Clara smiled faintly. "You just do." So he did. They sat on the floor of Lily's room one evening, building towers out of blocks. Lily was focused on her task, biting her lip the way Clara did when she was thinking. Edward reached out and gently covered her hand. "Can I tell you something important?" Lily looked up at him, eyes clear and waiting. "I'm your dad," he said, keeping his voice steady. "And I'm really sorry I wasn't here before. But I'm here now. And I want to be here for everything, if you'll let me." Lily stared at him for a long moment, so long he thought maybe he'd said it wrong. Then she nodded. "I knew." "You did?" She smiled a little. "You have the same eyes." He laughed, and it was thick with emotion. "I guess we do." She climbed into his lap then, wrapping her arms around his neck. He held her carefully, like she was made of something fragile and priceless all at once. "I'm glad you're here now," she whispered against his shoulder. "Men too," he said. And he meant it more than he'd ever meant anything. Clara stood in the doorway watching. She wiped at her eyes, but she didn't look away. She didn't try to stop the tears this time. Later that night, they sat on the couch again, closer now, their shoulders touching without needing an excuse. Clara leaned her head on his shoulder, and he rested his cheek against her hair. "She's incredible," he said. "She is," Clara agreed. "You did. She corrected softly, and for the first time, he let himself believe it. When the time came for Clara to return to work full-time, she asked him if he could pick Lily up from press school. She asked casually, like it was no big deal. But it was. She was letting him in, trusting him to be there. He was never late, not once. And every time Lily ran into his arms at pickup, it felt like a homecoming. It wasn't work perfect. There were arguments, misunderstandings, days where the past crept in and tried to mess things up. But they were learning. They were trying. And that mattered. When Lily's birthday came around, Clara suggested a small party at home. Edward went overboard, of course. There was cake and balloons and gifts that Lily loved, but Clara shook her head at in mock exasperation. "You're ridiculous," she told him, laughing. "You knew that when you married me," he said. She paused, looking at him with something in her eyes he couldn't quite name yet. "Yeah," she said softly. "I did. And maybe, just maybe, they weren't finished writing that story. Months blended into seasons, and by the time autumn painted the trees in colors Lily insisted looked like fire, Edward had made a place for himself he no longer questioned. He picked Lily up from school every Tuesday and Thursday. On Saturdays, they went to the park. She insisted on holding his hand when they crossed the street, even though she was starting to get too old for it. And on Sunday mornings, he made pancakes. Always with strawberries now. She said they tasted better that way, and he believed her. There were still moments when Clara would watch him with that look in her eyes. The one that said she was remembering the man he used to be and weighing him against the one he was becoming. But over time the look faded, replaced by something warmer, something closer to hope. One evening, after Lily had fallen asleep on the couch during movie night, he carried her to bed. Clara followed him, turning down the sheets and brushing back Lily's hair as he settled her in. They both lingered at the edge of the bed for a moment, just watching her breathe. "I never thought I'd see this," Clara said quietly. "She would." "You," she replied. "Here, like this." Edward looked at her. "I didn't either." But there they were, quiet, steady. When they left the room, Clara turned toward him in the hallway. They stood close, not by accident. He reached out slowly, as if waiting for her to stop him. She didn't. His fingers brushed her cheek, his hand settling at her jaw. She leaned into his palm. "I was angry for a long time," she said. "At everything. I deserved it." "Maybe," she agreed. "But you came back. You stayed." "I will keep staying," he promised. "As long as you'll have me." Clara let out a breath that sounded like something breaking and something healing all at once. She closed the distance between them and kissed him. Soft, certain. Familiar. It wasn't like it had been before. It was better, slower, real. And when they pulled apart, she was smiling. They didn't call it anything right away. They didn't label it or try to put it in a box. But it was there, between them, growing. One night, after Lily had gone to sleep, Clara found Edward sitting on the back porch, staring out at the yard. She sat down beside him, their knees bumping. "She calls you Dad now?" Clara said. Edward's throat tightened. "Yeah, she does. She asked me today if you'd always be around." He turned toward her. "What did you tell her?" "I told her yes, because I believe that now." He covered her hand with his. "You won't regret it." "I already don't." They sat there, watching the stars come out one by one. Lily's telescope was set up on the porch, something Edward had bought her for her last birthday, after she'd told him she wanted to see the places where the stars lived. He'd spent hours with her that night, learning the constellations he never cared about before. He looked at Clara now and thought, maybe this is what home feels like. The first time Lily called him Dad without hesitation was at the grocery store. She tugged on his sleeve and pointed at something on a high shelf. "Dad, can you get that for me?" He almost dropped the bag of apples in his hand. It wasn't the word itself. It was the way she said it. Like it was the most natural thing in the world. Like he'd always been that to her. And maybe he had been. He just hadn't known it yet. When they got home, Clara found him standing in the kitchen, staring at the groceries on the counter. "You okay?" she asked. He nodded. "She called me Dad." Clara smiled, walked over, and wrapped her arms around his waist. "You are." And he was. It wasn't about big moments after that. It was about the small ones. Helping Lily with her homework, listening to her talk about a book she was reading, making sure she brushed her teeth before bed. The everyday things that built a life. Sometimes, he'd catch Clara watching him, her gaze soft and knowing. He'd reach for her hand, or she'd kiss his temple, and neither of them had to say anything. They were in this together. A year after they'd first seen each other again in that hotel lobby, they took Lily to the beach. The same resort. Different season. She ran ahead of them, collecting shells, shouting back every time she found a good one. Edward and Clara walked slower, their fingers intertwined. "She's happy," Edward said. She is and you. Clara smiled at him. I am. He stopped walking, turned toward her fully. Marry me again. Clara blinked. What? Marry me again, he repeated. This time because we want to. Not because it makes sense on paper. Not because it ties anything together. Just because I love you. Because I want this life with you. She was quiet for a long time. Then she whispered. Okay, laughed. Relief and joy rushing through him. He kissed her, right there on the beach, with Lily shouting about finding a sand dollar in the distance. They didn't plan a big wedding. Just them. And Lily, of course. She was the flower girl, the ring bearer, and the maid of honor all at once. She held their hands during the vows and insisted on saying something herself. You my favorite family, she told them. Edward's voice cracked when he said, Ours too. They built a home after that. Not the biggest house, not the fanciest one, but it had a garden Lily could plant flowers in. It had an office where Edward worked less and read bedtime stories more. It had a porch where Clara and Edward sat at the end of the day, watching the sun go down. Edward still ran his company, but it no longer owned him. He took days off. He learned how to make Lily's favorite cookies without burning them. He took Clara on dates. The kind they used to dream about when they were younger, and everything felt too complicated. They were a family. When Lily graduated from college years later, Edward sat in the front row, holding Clara's hand. His little girl, all grown up, scanning the crowd until her eyes found them. She smiled, and it was still the same as the first time she reached for his hand on the beach. The same as when she called him Dad for the first time. Afterward, she hugged them both. Thanks for everything. Edward kissed her forehead. Thank you for finding me. Because that's what she'd done. She found him. Clara, too. They gave him something he hadn't known how much he needed until he had it. When Clara and Edward sat on the porch that night, watching the stars, he leaned into her. This is everything I didn't know I was missing, he said. Clara smiled. And you didn't even have to schedule it, Bah. He laughed, kissing her shoulder. Best decision I ever made. And it was. Because sometimes life doesn't give you second chances. But when it does, you take them. You hold them close. You make them count. And Edward Sterling made this one count. If you need more or another script, feel free to let me know.